So we are recording. And this is our last topic, our last official class. Um, and it's on ethics. And I thought it would be really an important thing to end sort of on an upbeat note, but also on one that would be, for a Judaism 101 class, for an intro to Judaism class, probably the most intuitive, the simplest in some ways, the least complex, the most knowable. I mean, most people know that it's important to be a good person. What you might not know is the connection to Jewish values, Jewish sources, the deep connection that being a Mensch, as we would call it in Yiddish, a good person, not just a man, but anyone who's a good person, what that's all about. And there are several aspects to it, which of course will then complicate matters and drive us all crazy. But I want to try to get a little taste of each into this class. We'll start with sort of the broad notion of loving your neighbor as yourself, that verse, what it means, living in God's image. Then we'll get into personal qualities of goodness and kindness, and what are those qualities that Judaism emphasizes. Then we'll get into more specific areas like business ethics, interpersonal ethics, language, words, lashon hara, gossip, and then we'll get into a little bit of medical ethics toward the end, because all of these are important. It's all about living a good life, living the right kind of life, living a Torah life. Ultra-Orthodox Jews would call it a Torah true life. And what's important, so important to focus on, is the idea that this is a major, major component of what it means to be a Jew. So many people come up to me. I can't count how many people have come up to me, and it hasn't changed over the years. Certain things have changed. This hasn't changed. People will come up, especially before a funeral, let's say, and say, my grandmother was a good person, maybe not such a good Jew. And I sort of understand what they're trying to say. Trying to say that my grandmother didn't light candles every week, or didn't come to services every Friday night or Shabbat morning, or cut corners on kashrut, or maybe didn't keep kosher at all. So by definition, that meant not being a good Jew. But a good person. And meaning, someone who gives charity, someone who is kind, someone who's welcoming, who's kind to animals, who's kind to other human beings, who tries to bring peace between people. Those are such important prime Jewish values that if your grandmother was like that, your grandmother, and I'll say this very often to the family, your grandmother was a good Jew. And so, but I hate to get into the whole question of what is a good Jew, what is a not so good Jew, how do you quantify what is a good Jew? It's pointless. The only point being that ethics is a major part of what it means to be a Jew. And those who are very observant of ritual laws would agree. They just might not emphasize it as much. So when people talk about, who is a kosher Jew, you're talking about food and Shabbat, basically. But a good Jew goes way beyond that. So that's a very important point to state right off. You're all good Jews. You come to class. You're good. Okay. So let's talk a little about loving your neighbor as yourself. This is the central verse of the Torah. Literally, it is right in the middle of the Torah. You open a scroll, I've mentioned this before, and you'll find it right there. So I don't think that is an accident. I think that was put there because, first of all, the book of Leviticus, where it falls, is the center of the 5 books. It's the 3rd book, and the middle of Leviticus, which is building up toward a holiness code, living a holy life, which involves ritual, it involves relationships, it also involves ethics. And right in the middle of it all is v'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. I could go into hours and hours of discussion of what that verse means. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? Who is your neighbor? Is it just your Jewish neighbor? Well, for the most part, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be someone who lives in proximity of you, meaning a physical, geographic neighbor, or a family member, or someone who's part of your tribe. Some use the word fellow. Some use the word friend. Re'ah, we have a group at Bethel called Re'ut, which does kind deeds for others, visits them in the hospital, does things like that. And that's from the same word. So it's just relationships, it's friendships, it's whatever you mean, but it means working with another person. And there are other verses in the same area of the Torah that talk about also doing good things for your enemy. So it's not like it just means your friend, meaning the person you like. Even the person you don't like, you should lift up his animal, let's say. So it also, loving your neighbor as yourself is, it sort of implies that you have to love yourself too. And I guess, there's a session we didn't have about Israel and the Holocaust. We could have had a session about loving yourself and, having good hygiene practices and all kinds of issues that, people, how much should you sleep? Maimonides gets into all that. That's all covered by Judaism. Study, good study practices. We're going to get into a little of that tonight. What are some of the qualities that you should develop to be a good person? But for the most part, tonight we'll be talking about things to do that are in relation to others, but also having to do with yourself. Oh, there's so many areas that we're not covering in this class. We're not really talking about sexual relationships. We're not really talking about life cycle. We didn't get into birth, death, weddings, all of bar mitzvah, but bat mitzvah, all that stuff. But there's just so much we can cover. All right, so love your neighbor as yourself. There are different versions of it. There's the version in the Torah that we have. There's about 100,000 versions, maybe not quite as much, but a lot of versions from other religions that are somewhat based on this or from some common cultural background, which you'll see in all kinds of religions. Most major religions have a version of the Golden Rule, including Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, you name it. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's the Golden Rule. But within Judaism, in rabbinic literature, there are other versions of it as well. For instance, Rabbi Akiva, who calls this a klal gadol b'Torah, an essential value of the Torah. Love your neighbor as yourself. You need to learn that. Hillel, in the famous story that I think we recounted in the first session, in fact, a lot of this overlaps a little bit with the first session. Hillel talks about it too, that this heathen came to his rival Shammai and said, "Convert me while I'm standing on one foot." Shammai sent him out, said, "No way, get out of my sight." Chased him with a rolling pin, basically. Guy goes to Hillel, "Convert me while I'm standing on one foot." Hillel says, "Sure," gets on one foot. He says, "While you're standing on foot, whatever." Hillel gets up on one foot and says, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. This is the essence of Torah. Now go and study." So he does it slightly differently. He sort of actually is closer to the Jesus version of the line. Not love your neighbor as yourself. Not quite do unto others as you would have them do unto you or whatever. But what's hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. It's a negative version of love your neighbor as yourself. And it's a fascinating discussion as to which is the more useful version of this line. By the way, you can always throw stuff into the chat if you have answers, if you have ideas, suggestions. I feel that Hillel was giving us love your neighbor as yourself 2.0, because it's much easier to not deal with the abstract idea of love your neighbor. What does it mean to love your neighbor? Give him a gift, bring over a cup of sugar? I mean, what does it mean to love your neighbor? But if you phrase it, what is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. You know very well what you don't like. You know very well what is hateful to you, whether it's, food you don't like, or if someone slaps you in the face, you don't like that. Don't slap your neighbor in the face. So it's much more concrete, much more specific, and easier to use that guidance to become a good person. So whatever version you choose, and you can probably come up with some more on your own, loving your neighbor as yourself is the essential element of Torah. Everything else flows from it. Now, another principle that I mentioned last week, and this is why we're doing this session right after the God session and even the Messiah session, because so much of the Jewish concept of God has to do not with what we believe God is, but with how we try to emulate what God does, how we can live lives that are God-like. And I gave you some examples last week, and we'll go through a little of that again. The whole notion of living in God's image, having been created in God's image. So again, you can believe whatever you want about God, and I gave you lots of different options last time, and there are many, 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 many more that you can find out there. Dogma, as I mentioned, is not a key to being Jewish. You can be a very good atheist Jew. Action is much more a key. Belief, although it does have its place and is important, the notion of a God, trying to grapple with God, Yisrael, struggle with God, is important. But the more important element is that we know we're in God's image. We're created in God's image. So what does it mean to be created in God's image? Well, it means that even if there isn't a God, we would have to invent a God, in a sense, because this notion of having this highest possible bar that is above us, that is beyond us, that we are less than, means we're not God. That's important in and of itself. Ethically, it's important, because if we're not God, we're not going to think of ourselves as lording over others. We won't. Someone who has this notion of humility under God is not going to be a vicious dictator. And in fact, the Torah really focuses on that, emphasizes that in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says every king has to write his, because it was all hymns back then, their own Torah. Every ruler has to write a Torah and can't get too strong, can't have too many spouses, can't bring the people back to Egypt. There are lots of little requirements, but the most significant one is to write their own Torah so that they are lesser than God. I mean, that's important. But more important is that we're in God's image. So this incredibly grand, somewhat abstract perhaps, notion of a divine being that is beyond us, above us, beyond our comprehension. We can't even spell the name. We can't even pronounce the name. But a little bit of that is in us. We are created in some way to be like God, so that we can act like God in all the good ways. So the idea of being in God's image is hugely important. And let's see if I can get us there. All right. So this is in the packet that was for last week. You can find it. Oops. Anyway, it's the same thing. It's right here. So you can all see it, right? It says Genesis 1:26. All right. Good. Now I'm back to the original slide. All right, so that is the verse where it says human beings were created in God's image. Tselem Elohim. God is talking to the angels and discussing how God is going to create these human beings. The word tselem, image, is a fascinating term, which actually is, a camera is a matzlema. So an image can be a photo as well. Sel means shadow, comes from the word that means shadow. So it's sort of like there's an eclipse and we see that reflection. That is the God that we see in other human beings. We don't actually see God when we look at other people, but there's a reflection, a shadow, just a sort of a residue of God in each of us. So what does that mean to have that sense of divinity, that we are all, in a sense, between animal and angel? We're in the middle. It means, and this is from Sanhedrin chapter 4, the Mishnah, part 5, and you can see that it talks about, this is the famous Talmudic passage that says, if you save a life, it's as if you saved the world. It's as if you saved all of the universe. That there is no value that you can assign to a human being. That's why we have the death penalty, by the way. This overlaps a little bit with some of the medical ethics and other things we'll be talking about later. We have the death penalty in Judaism on paper in the Torah, but not in practice. Almost never in practice. It's a wonderful compromise that was made, but you have to, if a human being is of infinite value and you murder a human being in cold blood, there is no price that you can pay that would compensate for that murder. There's no amount of money that could make up for taking a life if it's, murder. Now, killing sometimes has to be done in wartime, self-defense, etc. But murder is a whole different matter. So the rabbis came up with this formula where, yes, we have the death penalty, but it is so hard to prove someone guilty because it has to be done in such a way that there's absolutely no doubt that this was done of sound mind, and it's way beyond the shadow of a doubt. It goes way beyond it, to the point where there is a saying that in the rabbinic period, they had Sanhedrins, which were like tribunals or courts, actually had 70 on them, and they all had to agree for someone to have the death penalty. And if there was one person who was sent to death, capital punishment, in a generation, basically, they were called a hanging court. That they actually did that. Anyway, so the whole point is that all human beings are of infinite value, and if we are in God's image, and there's God in each of us, Jew, non-Jew, man, woman, non-binary, everyone has a little of God in them, then we're all equal. So the foundation of Jewish ethics comes from the verse, love your neighbor as yourself, but then as expanded in the notion of living in God's image, and this Sanhedrin 4.445, infinite value, we're all equal, and the notion that now if a human being creates copies, this was long before the Xerox machine, but they had stamps that they used to make coins. They understood that every coin would be the same, but when God makes a human being, every human being is somehow different. Everyone is unique. Each person is absolutely unique, and it's miraculous when you think about it. I mean, someone may look a little like their parents, but I think we can all safely say that we are not our parents, and we are not, for those who have children, not our children. They are very different people and unique. So the passage, which we're not studying in great detail, but it's a good one for you to look at on your own at some point, Sanhedrin, and it's in the Talmud. It's in the Mishnah, which of course is the first part of each Talmudic section, and it is just such a key passage worth studying. So equal, infinite value, unique. Those are foundations of Jewish ethics. And then we get back to, the whole notion of being godlike, because, again, it's not about what your theology is. But if you read the Torah and you study it, you will see that God welcomes Adam and Eve into the Garden of Eden, and from that we get the principle of haknasat hare'evim, those actually haknasat orchim, welcoming those who are guests. God welcomes, God dresses Adam and Eve, God buries Moses, which of course is a very important mitzvah to bury someone, to bury the dead. They can never thank us for it. It's an ultimate mitzvah. It's considered an act of kindness, chesed. God gives Israel manna in the desert, feeding the hungry, finds a bride for Isaac, helping those who are seeking partners in relationship, comforts Isaac after his mom dies, visiting a Shiva house. It comes from what God did, we do as well. Rescues Israel from Egyptian captivity. On the right side, these are not next to. This was a little game that I put together here. So you have to draw the crooked line down to Pidyon Shavuyim. So rescuing someone from captivity. Rescuing captives is a huge, huge mitzvah, which is why Israel, the Jewish state, always finds itself in a horrible predicament when one of theirs is taken captive. They will often give, in the case of several famous cases, they'll give dozens, if not hundreds, of captives. They'll trade for one person, for one soldier who's taken. Gilad Shalit being the most famous example not too long ago. And people were critical of it. But, he's now built a life for himself. He'd been captive in Gaza and, tortured. And I think Israelis are actually very proud of the fact. The only problem is you give back some prisoners who then go out and, cause more damage, possibly even killing again. So it's not an easy question. It's one of those ethical dilemmas we face, but the principle of redeeming captives is so important. All of that from being godlike. All right. So that's sort of the foundation. Let's move on from the foundation to a really interesting verse. Let's see if I can do this. Yes. This is found in our prayer book. Actually, this isn't a verse. It is actually a verse. It's a really long verse from Pirkei Avot, the what's called traditionally the ethics of our ancestors. It's also part of the Mishnah, part of the Talmud. It's a small part, but it was meant to be a guide, a user's guide, and a training manual for rabbis. How to be a good person basically is the first step in how to be a rabbi. So here we have in this section of Pirkei Avot a sort of an academic discussion. Sometimes they get into all these number games, what's more important, the priesthood or royalty or this or that. So they got into the question of Torah. And let me just admit someone who's in the waiting room. Okay, so we get into the whole question of what is the value of Torah? And the value of Torah, well, it's so important that it can't be acquired easily. It can only be acquired, as it says here, through 48 qualities. The crown of Torah. So in a sense, these qualities are teaching us Jewish values that we learn from Torah. And on the other hand, they're values that we should cultivate in order to be worthy of the study of Torah. That, being a mensch, basically. So this is in our prayer book. I took this page out of, sorry. We should make sure to put on the mute button if you can. Okay. All right. So anyway, so here are the qualities that are determined to be of greatest significance to someone who's aspiring to be a rabbi, a Torah teacher, and one who embodies the values of Torah. So as I said, this is in our prayer book, Lev Shalem. Talk about, we talk about reading outside the margins. This is actually in the margins. And it's one of those passages of study that is at the beginning of the Shabbat morning service. We don't usually go through all of these. Sometimes we go through a few of them on weekdays, but this one is just perfect. So basically, you want to know how to be a mensch? Through study, through a listening ear, through careful use of speech, through an understanding heart, through insight, through awe, through humility, through joy, through attending to scholars, through considered discussion with companions, through challenging exchanges with students. These are all, of course, good translations, but also really relevant current translations. It makes it a little easier to understand. And we go down and patience, such an important value, a good heart, trust in scholars, acceptance of suffering. You see that on the bottom right? Acceptance of suffering. Wow. That's a good value. You know, I mean, they obviously didn't meet my grandmother, but she would just walk around shaking her head all the time. "Ay, terrible, everything is terrible." But you know what? She lived a good long life, so I think there was something to that. Maybe that was her way of accepting suffering. All right, knowing one's place. You don't have to agree with all these, by the way. Through being beloved. Ahuv. So it's really what it's saying is opening yourself up to being loved. It's not just about, you know, being lucky enough, fortunate enough to have people who appreciate, love you, whatever, but being open to it. Oh, Hevet Hamakom, love God. God is called Hamakom here. God is the place. Interesting name for God that's often used by the rabbis. God is every place. God is everywhere. But that means God is every specific place where you happen to be. That is a sacred place. That is holy ground. Right now, we're all standing on holy ground. I mean, there's so much we can do with this. Loving justice, loving honesty, welcoming criticism. I'm a little critical of that. No, I'm just kidding. But, you know, shunning honors. Oh, boy. Obviously, these rabbis did not belong to synagogues. No, they've ran them, I guess. I don't know. Not becoming arrogant because of one's studies. They wanted the rabbi not to get too big for their britches. Not being joyful in decision making. Rabbis were judges as much as they were rabbis. They did spend most of their time, especially in Babylonia, in the Talmudic times, deciding cases. And you shouldn't feel like, you know, even if you don't like the person that you're going to rule against, you shouldn't feel any joy in that. You should feel a seriousness, the weight of your decision making. That's what that's saying. Sharing in another's burdens, judging others favorably, which is so important. Give the benefit of the doubt. I mean, we have English expressions for many of these too. This is not rocket science, but as a package, it creates this ambiance, this atmosphere of Jewish ethics, what it means to be a good Jew. Okay? So go to shul on Shabbat, absolutely. But do this too. Learning in order to do so. That just, learning for its own sake, but also to teach. And the last one is actually, in some ways, some call it the most important. Reporting sayings in the speaker's name. Because it's at the root of all humility, of all trust. And now we're dealing with, artificial intelligence. You got to be able to say where you got the knowledge from. There's this whole notion that we inherit a world a little worse than the world that was before us. In other words, at JTS, my seminary, we worshipped our rabbis who worshipped their rabbis who worshipped their rabbis. So you come down to us and we're just the little, mini rabbis. But we should never think of ourselves as fake rabbis either, unworthy. But on the other hand, not quite as worthy as our predecessors. There's a humility that we need because that's the opposite of what we see most in our world, where we think, well, we throw away the old and, we're going to do something newer, better, whatever. I think that's human nature. So really what we're talking about here is countering human nature, being counterintuitive. But reporting sayings in the speaker's name, it's about, you know, not copying something and you know, not giving credit. Obviously, plagiarizing is not a good thing, and in rabbinic literature, you almost never see it, because you're always going to see the rabbi say, I'm quoting this, who that was said by this, who was quoting this, who was quoting that. They'll go back generations in order to try to get the source of the quote. Sometimes it's not done that well, but it's done. Now, there are times when, for instance, books are written in the name of, like, you know, Song of Songs is ascribed to Solomon. Solomon probably didn't write it, but whoever wrote it wanted people to read it, so they said Solomon wrote it. The same thing with the Zohar. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai didn't write it, but you say it's by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, people are going to read it. So, you know, sometimes you go to extremes, and maybe not quite honestly, but that's also part of the game. So anyway, any questions so far? I'm looking at the chat. I don't see anything in there. All right, so I'm going to go on. So this is a little something. By the way, all of these sources, you know, as always, I'm going to put them in the whole the website that has all the stuff here. So you can find all of this. You can find that that passage I just showed you afterwards. I'll be sending it out. I did this a few years ago. I took that section from Pirkei Avot, and for the entire month before the high holidays, I took one of them and expanded upon it for personal growth. So I called it Mensch Marks for the Jewish Year, and that's actually how I came up with the title for the book. This has nothing to do with the book. This came out before the book, but I like the idea of Mensch Marks because they're benchmarks of how to be a better person. So, you know, I'll just give you an example of what we've got here. So a listening ear, that was one of the ones we saw at the beginning of that passage, how important it is to listen. It's one of those 14, by the way, the word 48 rather, in that passage, they're called midot. You see the word here in the second paragraph, attributes. Midah can also be a consequence, or a measure. But in this case, in this context, they are attributes. And that's an important idea because we have a whole branch of Jewish knowledge known as Musar. It's actually very spiritual, but not in a Kabbalistic way, not in an esoteric way. Musar is the study of cultivating character, being a mensch. So here's one, listening ear. Let me just throw one at you. I'm going to give a few examples. Loving all creatures, ohevet habriot. All of these are key values, and I threw in some of my own observations for many of these. Minimal frivolity, maximal irony. Okay, this is a long one. Loving God, ohevet hamakom. Interesting, it doesn't say ohevet Adonai, loving God by the name we often use, but makom, again, puts God in the context of something that's very real, the place we are, the state we're in, the relationships we have, seeing God in all of those contexts, the God of love. Okay, let me throw a little curveball. Number 7, a minimum of sleep. Eileen, you perked up. I could see. So this is a Jewish quality that cultivates character? Not sleeping? Boy, I had a good character long before I realized it. But it comes from the book of Proverbs. I'm just going to read what I have here. The chapter warns the reader against becoming a lazybones and ending up impoverished. So it's not about, you know, getting 8 hours of sleep. You should get a minimum of 8 hours of sleep. Okay, it's not saying don't be healthy. But what it's saying is while you're awake, don't be asleep, which comes from having a good night's sleep at night. So it's sort of, you know, again, counterintuitive. But the idea is not so much the actual physical state of sleep, but the state of procrastination and laziness. And it, for the rabbis, it had a lot to do with being ready to wake up at a moment's notice. The actual physical act of waking up when, they didn't have alarm clocks, they had roosters. So when the rooster crows, it's time to get up. As a Jewish ethical value, midah, the concept of mi'ut shena, encourages an individual to maintain a minimum amount of sleep in order to be wakeful for the study of Torah. As Rabbi Reuven Bulka has written, an individual who's excited about Torah opportunities want to stretch the day. One day of doing it is by sleeping less. All right? That's up to you. I think, though, there's a real lesson here that goes beyond, just opening up the Torah and studying the book of Genesis. It's about an approach to life. Do we wake up in the morning excited to be doing whatever we're going to be doing that day? Or do we wake up in the morning saying, oh my God, another day? Or as my grandmother would say, oh, it's terrible. There's the value here about respecting your grandparents too, so I better move on. But I think that's what this is getting at, this quality, all right? Then I talk about Jewish time. So let me give you another one. We did this for 40 days. Minimum of small talk. It's really interesting because a lot of the values of good behavior, good character for a Jew have to do with speech. We take words very seriously. Of course, that, even the name of God is just a perfect example of that we don't just assign God any name. We don't swear, in God's name, all of that. But anyway, this is talking about small talk. The midah is focused on minimizing conversation. Our text suggests that too much talking can lead to transgressions, while minimizing talking is considered a sign of intelligence. I think we could sort of agree that there are some people who talk too much. But I think we also need to look at, maybe we're one of them. And I'm not looking at anyone, by the way. This is, this is important because we need filters. We need to be able to understand the impact of our words. And of course, if we do damage with our words, how to heal that damage, how to correct it. So this gets us into the topic of lashon hara, and gossip, and I'm going to return to it, but I want to just do one more because this is well timed. Here we are, number 10. Moderation in business. So moderation, big thing for Maimonides. But also, I would say in Judaism, there's a real focus on moderation. But it's not just about moderation. So here's where I can just give you a little bit about business ethics. So here we go. Again, you have all this. I'm not going to, you can look at this on your own. I'm not going to go into it in great detail. But I want to highlight some of the keys to Jewish business ethics, which stem from this midah of moderation in business, which means, not to make business so important to your life that it becomes an obsession, so much of an obsession that you're tempted to do something you wouldn't ordinarily do. So, 8 basic principles. Accurate weights and measures. This is found in the Torah, right near love your neighbor as yourself, in fact, and well discussed in the Talmud, in the Mishnah. It's just so important to cultivate honesty in business, to be known as an honest business person. That reputation is itself capital, that you don't spend lightly. You have to hoard that kind of capital, that kind of reputation. So, in the Torah, it talks a lot about equal weights and measures, not putting your thumb on the scale. Second category, not deceiving people. So, of course, in business, especially in the marketplace, that happens a lot. Um, and if it happens, it needs to be corrected, but it shouldn't happen. And it goes beyond just uh, the seller not deceiving the customer. The customer shouldn't deceive the seller either. So you shouldn't lead someone on into believing that you're really interested in buying something when you're not at all interested in buying something. Now, if you're like looking at cars and you're just starting out and you want to hear the whole spiel about this car, but you have no intention of buying it, that's, sort of okay. That's part of what the dealer, they know they're dealing with that. Cars aren't something people just buy on the spot, except me. Sometimes I do. But if you're just, just leading the seller on, and then you say, no, I'm not going to buy, a half hour later, that's a half hour of that person's life that could have been used going to the next customer and possibly making a sale and putting food on the table for their family. So, it's really an important element. So that's number 2. Onaat devarim, based on another verse in Vayikra, in Leviticus, do not deceive one another. That also is related to what I just discussed. And stealing a person's mind, gnevat da'at, false packaging, false labeling. Okay, so that's stealing a mind. There's also a notion of putting a stumbling block before the blind. That's another quote from Leviticus. It's another law in Leviticus, which can be interpreted to be about disability, and absolutely. But it's so cruel and callous that you almost have to think that it's going beyond that, and it is. The rabbis interpret that as meaning someone who is not knowledgeable in a certain area. You got to be honest with that person. So you shouldn't lead them into believing something, whether it's about who to vote for and their policies, or about a product that you're selling. That it's guaranteed to that 9 out of 10 dentists love it. I don't know, whatever you're using as your pitch, it should be an honest pitch. Okay, and so anyway, that's business ethics. I wanted to give you a little sense of that, but there's of course so much more that you can get to. So I'm not going to move beyond that. So any questions so far? In 5 minutes, we covered all of Jewish business ethics. Let's move on to gossip. We're getting a first-hand lecture on how to be a mensch, and you cannot cover that topic without dealing with gossip. So let me go here. I've got all of these bars here. Okay. So this week's portion, Aaron and Miriam gossip about Moses. This week's portion of Bahalotcha. It's a famous incident. They talk about him taking a Cushite woman. We don't really know what they're talking about. Moses' wife, Tzipporah, was Midianite. So are they accusing him of having another wife? Well, he wouldn't be the first biblical character to have multiple wives. The word Cushite is interesting because in later times, the translation might mean Ethiopian, or it might even have racial qualities, and that gets us into very serious territory here, that they're gossiping about that. But for the most part, that's not the direction that commentaries go in, at least the Jewish commentaries. Whatever it is, they were gossiping about Moses, and God didn't like it. Miriam is afflicted with leprosy, and Aaron sort of gets off scot-free. What can I say? But leprosy is considered the appropriate punishment for gossip because it renders someone socially unavailable, unacceptable, out of the mainstream. In other words, the person who has leprosy has to leave the community. The person who is known as a gossip is ejected from normal social discourse and is rejected by others who know that if I take this person into my confidence, they are going to just talk about me in the way that they talked about Moses. You know, there's a lot of misogyny here in the treatment of Miriam, but in the end, what's beautiful about this this section of the portion is that Moses prays for Miriam's healing personally, and comes up with the most spontaneous, one of the first spontaneous prayers, a healing prayer, in Miriam's behalf. El na rafana la, please God, please heal her. And Miriam is healed. So that is the happy ending to this story. But the pertinence for us is the whole notion of gossip. So there was a guy named the Chafetz Chaim, means the one who loves life. It comes from a psalm. You might even know the melody. Mi ha'ish hechafetz chaim. Who is the person who loves life? Ohev yamim lirot tov, loves all of that person's days and sees the good. Nitzor lashon chamera, keep your language, keep your tongue from speaking evil. So that's all in that psalm. And Chafetz Chaim isn't his real name, but he took the name because he wanted to take on this cause of proper speech. And he lived in the 19th century, not that long ago, but is seen as probably the foremost authority for all time for Judaism on sacred speech. So here are some of his rules that he came up with that are based on older and more traditional rules. It's not like he made them all up. And I'll just go over some of them. You might recall that at one point, years and years ago in the congregation, we did an experiment where I asked people between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur not to talk about anyone, not to gossip. It was a lot of fun. The result was that no one succeeded because it's impossible to succeed. This is a sin, Lashon Hara. It is absolutely a sin. It's mentioned on Yom Kippur among all the sins we mention, and it's a sin that it is impossible not to commit. Everyone does. We are all going to fail, but we can also do teshuvah, which is, of course, the idea that we're imperfect, and this is a perfect example of how imperfect we are. So here are some of the rules that we get about Lashon Hara. 10 basic rules here. It's Lashon Hara, gossip, to convey a derogatory image to someone, even if that image is accurate. You can't say it's true, but so what? Because that's an even worse form of gossip, of Lashon Hara, because it's slander. And in the Jewish context, slander doesn't have to be false. It's not a legal term, as in suing for slander. It is an ethical term, a moral term of defaming someone. So, if you saw someone do something pretty horrible, like a rabbi eat a ham sandwich in a restaurant, maybe it wasn't really the rabbi, but his or her twin or their twin. Whatever it is, you can go to extremes here, but the whole notion is you should always give the benefit of the doubt. That was one of the qualities we talked about. And you're spreading potentially false, but even if apparently true, damaging information that could cost that person their job and not just the livelihood, but again, food on the table. So, number 2, a statement which is not actually derogatory, but ultimately causes someone physical, financial, emotional harm is also Lashon Hara. Hurtful words spoken directly to a person are another form of Lashon Hara. So there are a lot of, these are a couple in one. Let's say you have something good to say about someone. You have, 3 people are talking, and the fourth person is the one you're talking about, and the three people are saying, one person says, he's a horrible person, another person saying, horrible person, third person, you, saying, no, actually, and then you're going to list off all the amazing things that this person did. That might seem like a good thing, and yeah, you do want to defend someone. In some cases that actually could be good if it could cost someone, their livelihood again, if you sort of leave it unchecked. But if you say something good about a person and you know that these other two people do not like that person, it's just egging them on to say, oh, no, that's not true. I saw da 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 da. So it's creating an atmosphere where more bad things can be said. So it's not even good to say something good about someone. Basically, you shouldn't talk about other people, which is why it's impossible to fulfill this mitzvah. And you can't relate it even to close relatives. I've never gotten a clear indication about whether a spouse is, because sometimes confidentially you should be able to bounce things, especially if it's a professional situation. But at least in principle, you shouldn't be reciting Lashon Hara to close relatives, to speak out against a community. You should never do that. All right. So anyway, these are some of the proper rules of speech. And anyway, so the rest of this little packet, which again you will get, gives you guidelines. It's Lashon Hara, even if it's true, even if a listener pressures the speaker to tell, even if names are left out, because you can sometimes guess the names. If it's about the speaker's family, if the speaker includes them. There are times when Lashon Hara is absolutely appropriate, and here it is. If there's going to be harm, the principle in Judaism always is life takes precedence. Certainly if there's a threat to life, if a potential murderer is on the loose and you have some information that you've promised to keep confidential, you don't have to keep that confidential. All right, so I wanted to do a little about Lashon Hara. And so any questions now? All right, we're skipping merrily along. I want to show you one example. This is about language as well. This is a Talmudic passage from Tractate Ketubot 17a. It is one of, it's funny. It's a little bit, if we're looking at it from the perspective of our times, a little bit misogynistic and other things, and yet very interesting. So there is a tradition of dancing before the bride and groom at a wedding. You've probably seen it if you've been to a Jewish wedding. It's actually more than just a custom. It's really an important part of the ceremony, an essential part at the reception. And part of it was to recite a formulaic passage saying how fair and attractive, how beautiful the bride is. Now, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel always argued, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. And so Beit Shammai, Shammai's school, contends that in a case of, in this case, it's talking about disability, it's talking about appearance. And if it would be a lie to say that this is a beautiful bride, you shouldn't say, you should be honest, because the Torah tells us to keep far from a false matter. Beit Hillel says to the house of Shammai, absolutely not. First of all, it's subjective, and beauty is subjective. And certainly you can't question the judgment of the groom or the bride or anyone in that situation who's closely involved. So all of that having been said, it's still, it's not nice. It basically hurting someone's feelings. So even if you feel strongly, and if you feel that objectively this person is not an attractive person, you should say the person's an attractive person. Anyway, I just thought it was an interesting passage to talk about how sensitive, so sensitive, our sages were to language, even if they weren't sensitive to gender roles and other things, insults and all of that. They would not want to offend if it can possibly be avoided. And it's just what, a married couple would say when one comes down the stairs dressed for dinner and you absolutely cannot stand what that person is wearing, and you say, "You look incredible." That's called Shalom Bayit, and it's a principle that even supersedes honesty. Shalom Bayit means peace in the home. So I wanted to show you that because that's an important value. So now, here we go. 38 more Jewish values. Some of them are based on the passage I showed you before. I'm not going to do all 38, but I want to focus on a few that you should know the terms. So, for instance, chesed, number 6, compassion. Rachamim comes from the word meaning womb, and it's that kind of protectiveness that compassion demands. And it's considered to be one of the pillars. It's said in Pirkei Avot, again in that passage, that book rather, of instructions for rabbis on 3 things the world stands. Gmilut chasadim is one of them, which means acts of kindness. Acts of kindness. And another very similar term, which we'll see down below, is tzedakah. Gmilut chasadim usually involves actions. Tzedakah often involves donations, and involves giving money, but also as an act of kindness. Here's number 8, Darchei Shalom, ways of peace. I talked about peace in the home and how important peace in the home is. Talmudic rulings preserve societal peace, including relieving tensions between Jews and non-Jews, feeding the poor, etc. Darchei Shalom, the ways of peace. Shalom is such an essential value. Let's see. I mentioned this before, but I'm going to again. Oops, sorry for making you dizzy. Lifnei iver. Do not put a stumbling block before a blind person. The prohibition against putting a stumbling block applies frequently to the sin of keeping someone in ignorance from information that will protect them. So again, an important lo ta'amod al dam re'acha. Number 20 here, do not stand by the blood of your neighbor. It's a prohibition against passivity in the face of violence to others. It is a prime Jewish value to take action, not stand on the sidelines. Passivity, this would tie into a discussion about the Holocaust or Israel, where so many combated evil with either apathy or just being paralyzed, not acting. And Elie Wiesel, for one, would say that is the opposite of evil. It's not good, but inaction, apathy. So that's another prime Jewish value. And this one, saving of a life, pikuach nefesh. It supersedes all other Jewish values and laws. It is the prime value, the highest Jewish obligation that overrides almost every other law, as I said. Not every, but almost every, including Shabbat, including Yom Kippur. One can fast on Yom Kippur up to the point where a life is in danger. And there's a famous incident involving Rabbi Israel Salanter, one of the great Musar specialists of the 19th century, who ate in front of his congregation on Yom Kippur because of a cholera epidemic. He wanted to make sure that people would not hesitate to stay well, to stay healthy. So he famously was asked once if there are any special rules that they should know to give for the people who are doing the baking of the matzot before Passover. And he said, yes, a very important rule to make sure they're paid on time. So again, Musar. Tzedek Tzedek Tirdov, number 34, pursue justice. Not just one time, it says justice twice. We should pursue it in just ways. So the ends can't justify the means here, but justice justly. All right, and that's pretty much it. There's one more actually I wanted to show you. Here it is, number 32, Tsar Baalei Chayim, prohibition of cruelty to animals, based on verses in the Torah, and very important to the rabbis. Okay, I know that we're at 8 o'clock. I'm just in a little bit more, but again, I'm looking to see. I've lost my bar here. If there are any questions, just open up your mute because I can't find the questions. Hold on, wait, I can do this. Yeah, where is it? How come it's not appearing? Anyway, all right. So here is a a periodic table of making mensches. Again, you can find this on your own. I'll send it to you. It's kind of cute, but it puts all of these qualities together, but puts them in categories: wisdom, courage, honor, justice, moderation, and transcendence. And finally, I just want to spend a moment on medical ethics. I already talked about how saving a life is the ultimate value, and I think that presents itself. But I want to show you the Oath of Hippocrates. Probably needs no other explanation. Let's see if I can do this now. All right, I still can't find my bar. Oh, wait, here, it's on the bottom. All right, no, nothing in the chat. All right, so Maimonides has his own medical oath. And I used to teach this class to teenagers on Jewish medical ethics. In the first class, we would compare the Hippocratic oath to the Maimonidean oath. And I'll just read his oath. Thy eternal providence has appointed me to watch over the life and health of thy creatures. May the love for my art actuate me at all times. May neither avarice nor miserliness nor thirst for glory or for a great reputation engage my mind. For the enemies of truth and philanthropy could easily deceive me and make me forgetful of my lofty aim of doing good to thy children. May I never see in the patient anything but a fellow creature in pain. Grant me strength, time, and opportunity always to correct what I have acquired, always to extend its domain, for knowledge is immense, and the spirit of man can extend indefinitely to enrich itself daily with new requirements. Today, you can discover the errors of yesterday, and tomorrow can obtain a new light on what he thinks himself sure of today. O God, thou hast appointed me to watch over the life and death of thy creatures. Here I am ready for my vocation, and now I turn unto my calling. So without getting into the Hippocratic Oath, it's much more about the profession, whereas Maimonides is much more about the human enterprise that he has engaged in healing and the partnership with God. May I never see in the patient anything but a fellow creature in pain. I want my doctors to read this. I mean, I think they're fine doctors, whatever, but I want every doctor to read this. And I know that in Jewish medical schools, at least, they do. Now, you can tell me maybe it's true in other medical schools as well. But that is, the basic principle. So when I've taught this class, I mean, there's so many areas of importance. This is an old textbook. Things change, have changed so much. But the key areas of euthanasia, transplants, abortion, allocation of scarce medical resources, genetic engineering, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg. These are important areas, all of them, that need to be, studied and understood. The basic principle, we can get into each individually, we don't have time to do that, but the basic idea is that life over death, human life. So in the case of abortion, that would mean the life of the mother, since the child is not considered fully human until born, by pretty much all authorities. But there's just so much here. So I'm going to stop, but I'll also just make a couple of final comments. Hillel, that great sage we've mentioned a few times, said, in a world that lacks humanity, be human. Makom she'ein anashim hishtadel liot ish. I think that's a good principle. And here's something Rabbi Israel Salanter said. At first I tried to change the world and failed. Then I tried to change my city and failed. Then I tried to change my family and failed. Finally, I tried to change myself, and then I was able to change the world. That is the Jewish way. To what end? Try to change ourselves in order to change the world, to perfect the world, to heal the world, to repair the world, or really just to take the first step in that direction to make the world a little better for our having been here, a little better than it was when we found it, and leaving it for those who come after a better place. Always focusing on these principles, these values, these ideas that are immortal, that will outlive all of us and live on for thousands of years. To save a life, you save the world. And love your neighbor as yourself. So that's going to conclude our little journey into the basics of Judaism. And I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions or anything to end us off? All right.
I just wanted to point out that Jewish people seem to dominate the helping professions. And we kind of discussed why today.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's something, I try not to overdo it when people say, all these Nobel Prize winners are Jewish, whatever. I think education is an important value that I really didn't get into a lot either. But helping, it's something to be proud of. It's almost stereotypical that people measure achievement by accomplishment when really we should be measuring achievement in, my kid's a Mensch. That's an achievement. That's the achievement. Whether they're a doctor, a lawyer, a rabbi. Anyway, but a Mensch. That really is probably the measure we should have more than anything else. But thanks for that point, Jeff. Really appreciate it. All right, thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, and I'll send it out, as I've said, tomorrow.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Stay safe.
Good night.